This week on Q&A, our guest is Alex Gibney, writer and director of a new documentary called Casino Jack. It's about Jack Abramoff, who went to prison in November 2006 and was released to a halfway house last week. Mr. Abramoff pled guilty to 3 felony counts of defrauding Indian tribes and conspiring to bribe public officials.
Alex Gibney, what was your reaction when you heard that Jack Abramoff had just been released from prison to a halfway house in Baltimore this week?
Well, I knew it was going to happen. And frankly, I thought he had spent enough time in stir. There are some other people who might well have gone to prison that didn't. So Jack has paid the price. He's out in a halfway house. I think that's all right.
When was the first time that you thought about doing your documentary, brand new, called Casino Jack and the United States of Money?
Well, I read some of the stories in the Washington Post, and I was astounded really by sort of the audacity of the story and how colorful it was. So that I thought it would make a good movie, because I'm always interested in stories per se. And Jack is a fascinating character, very colorful, very outrageous. At the same time, the other thing about it that was really interesting to me was it was a story that seemed to me to point out the most fundamental problem in our democracy right now, which is the way that money rules our democracy. It's become so unbalanced that I think it's become the fundamental problem in our society.
Let's run a clip just so the audience can get some sense of where you're going with this. And this is about 1:25 seconds, and it's near the beginning of the documentary.
It was immediately apparent that it was going to be a much bigger deal because he was such a well-known figure on Capitol Hill, really an uber lobbyist. And his connections were so widespread, both in the Republican Party itself and in the Republican Congress.
The government says Abramoff has admitted to bribing as many as 20 members of Congress.
His activities went far beyond lawful lobbying.
He was the #1 lobbyist in Washington who can get you in touch with the best and most influential members of Congress.
It's amazing how many members of Congress wanted in with Jack.
Mr. President, if you say you don't fear anything.
When the story broke, President Bush publicly tried to distance himself from Jack Abramoff.
I frankly don't even remember having my picture taken with the guy.
All of a sudden, nobody remembered Jack Abramoff.
I don't know him.
Of course Bush knew him. Absolutely.
It's just amazing how close Abramoff and his people got to the levers of power in Washington.
We had no idea that it would lead to the resignation of Tom DeLay, to the conviction of Bob Ney, to Tony Rudy, to Neil Volz. So many people were pulled into this web. Ralph Reed, John Doolittle, Karl Rove, Dick Armey, Conrad Burns, Don Young, Grover Norquist. It was all about the money.
One of the interesting things is almost everyone on that screen is gone from where they were when they either got in trouble or they were in office. A couple of them are still there. Who did we just see, and why did you start with those people?
I started with those people because it was interesting to me to show that Jack Abramoff wasn't on the periphery, that he was at a certain moment in time, his moment, the late 90s, early 2000s, that he was at the center of Washington. And so you saw a lot of people there, Dick Armey, Grover Norquist, Ralph Reed, Karl Rove, and others and George W. Bush, who were right at the center of power in Washington, because I think there had been a pretty concerted attempt to use Abramoff in a way to be the scapegoat. Not that he didn't do things wrong, he did a lot that was dead wrong, but to lay all the blame at his doorstep, as if to say, oh, Jack was a unique character who operated on the fringes of government, didn't have much effect on anybody. The fact is, he was at the center, and that's why I showed a lot of those people.
You've done several other documentaries, but go back to the beginning of when you personally got interested in politics.
Well, I was always interested in politics, and it was always about finding a way in. I mean, I think some years back, something happened. I'd done a number of TV documentaries, and then at a certain point in time, it seemed like there was an opportunity to say things in a more interesting way by doing documentaries that might be seen first in theaters. And the first one of those that I did was one I wrote and produced called The Trials of Henry Kissinger. Then right after that, I did one that really sort of broke through called Enron, The Smartest Guys in the Room, which was about that famous scandal at Enron. Then I did a film called Taxi to the Dark Side, which was about the Bush administration's policy of torture, which was a very important project to me because my father had been a Navy interrogator in World War II. And I did a film called Gonzo, The Life and Work of Dr. Hunter S. Thompson, about the famous Gonzo journalist. And then now recently, Casino Jack in the United States of Money.
How would you define your politics?
Hard to say. A skeptic. I wouldn't. I tend to look at things skeptically, and I try to seek out stories that have a kind of moral component, rather than, here's to the Democrats or here's to the Republicans. I think it's fair to say that I often give Republicans a hard time. At the same time, in the film Taxi to the Dark Side, some of the heroes of that film are Republicans. So, I tend to look at things from the point of view of a moralist.
Your father, Frank Gibney, is he still alive, and what does he do, or what did he do for a living?
My father, Frank Gibney, is no longer with us. He died a few years ago. He was a writer and editor. He was vice chairman of the board of editors at Encyclopedia Britannica. He worked at Time and at Newsweek, Life magazine. He was a journalist. And during the war, World War II that is, he learned Japanese as part of his experience to become an interrogator, and that set him off as a journalist. He became the youngest bureau chief, I think, in Tokyo. But he had a big influence on me because he never lost his ability to be curious.
From your documentary, here is Jack Abramoff and the College Republicans.
You can't get a 35-year-old to teach the Republican Party how to get to young people. You just can't rely upon it. Young people have got to reach other young people, and that's what we're seeking to do. First of all, voter registration is probably the most important function that we are undertaking now.
And this is a generation who came onto campus in the 1970s rebelling against the 60s, the whole ethos of the 60s.
We are hoping that Mr. Nixon, through his past, we've seen that he's at least more anti-communist than the last administration.
I was a young American for freedom. We were always working in coordination with the college Republicans, but they weren't ideologically conservative enough for us until Jack Abramoff got involved. Then they became ideologically conservative.
And it's Abramoff?
Right.
Okay. Chairman, College Republican National Committee. Okay.
Abramoff is a little older than I am, but I was a college Republican in the early 80s, and in a lot of ways when the college Republicans took that sharp turn to the right, that's the same direction I was going in. A lot of the same heroes. I thought Ronald Reagan was like the greatest man who ever lived.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
Where do you find things like that clip of Karl Rove or Dana Rohrabacher?
Oh, man. We just dig and dig and dig. I mean, our eyes bugged out when we saw those things when they first came into our cutting room. But that's one of the fun things about my job. You start looking, and you start believing that stuff is out there that hasn't been seen before, and you usually find something.
How do you find? I mean, just if I were sitting in your shoes, who would you call to find something like that?
Well, the first place you start is you go to the networks and you say, send me all your material that has stuff about either Jack Abramoff or Karl Rove or others, and sometimes you get stuff. But then sometimes there's certain incidents you're interested in, and there's another incident in the film about this famous sort of right-wing Woodstock that Jack Abramoff held in Angola. We knew about it. The networks had a tiny clip, but we kept asking people who had been there if they knew of anybody who was shooting it. And lo and behold, we got a name. We tracked that name down. We found the person in London. We asked him if he still had footage, and lo and behold, he had 20 hours of it. So it's a lot of shoe leather.
Where are you based, and how many people would work on something like this documentary?
Well, I'm based in New York City. I live in New Jersey, the great state of New Jersey. And I have an office in Chelsea in New York City. And we have a very small core dedicated crew. I'd say the core group on this film was about 6 people, but it expands massively to be about 50, by the time you bring in cinematographers, assistant editors, the people who mix the film, some of the outlying researchers. We employ people, sometimes in different places all over the world to do this or that for us as we're putting something together.
Here's some more familiar faces, and it's a Republican National Convention. Don't have the year here, maybe you can remember it, and some faces that we haven't seen for a while. Frank Fahrenkopf. Now let's watch this and get your reaction to it.
Ladies and gentlemen, the chairman of the College Republican National Committee, Jack Abramoff, for purposes of addressing the convention. Let's welcome Jack.
The party wanted me to give a rah, 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 we're all young people speech, and they rejected my speech. And I got up to the podium, and their speech went up on the teleprompter.
Fellow Republicans, I come before you today representing American students, the future of our Republican Party.
And as I deviated from that text and went back to my text, which I had memorized, the teleprompter fellow was looking for this on the speech. So the teleprompters are going up and down and up and down.
The first political experience of my generation was an America next drooping with hostage shame and shoulders burdened with the Democrats' no growth, no win future.
All of a sudden, I felt a rumbling under my feet. I was told that they're going to lower the floor to get rid of me. So I'm grabbing a hold of the podium, holding it as hard as I can, giving my speech.
Today's students know that support of anti-Soviet freedom fighters and victory over communism guarantees us security for our nation. Thank you.
Did you have to manipulate that video to show that?
You mean the little shaking of the podium?
Either the shaking of the podium or the fact that they supposedly were lowering the podium?
The shaking of the podium, I think, was there. The lowering, I think, was a little bit of a poetic license.
So why did you pick that?
Why did I pick that clip? Again, it was interesting to me to see young Jack, that this was a guy who didn't just pop onto the scene. This was a guy who was a very confident political activist, really a zealot. And you can kind of see his both the poise that he had, his willingness to go before a big crowd, but also the sense that he wasn't going to play by the rules. He wasn't going to do what other people said. I thought those were the two interesting things about that. He was very interested in power, very interested in politics, but not willing to play by other people's rules. So it seemed a pretty instructive episode.
As you know, when he went to prison in Cumberland, Maryland, he was supposed to be there, I guess, according to what I've read, till 2012. He got out this week. How well do you know him, and why did he get out early?
Well, my understanding is that the sentence was revised to a 4-year sentence with time already served. So he was supposed to be in for another 6 months, and he went through a drug rehab program and got out early to go to a halfway house near Baltimore. I think that, I knew him. I had met him, I believe, very briefly, long ago, prior to going into prison. But I did, in fact, go visit him while he was in prison, and we had a number of very long talks. It was very interesting and instructive for me. I tried very hard to interview him on camera, but the Department of Justice took a very dim view of that and intervened.
Why?
I don't know why. We tried very hard to get an answer from the Department of Justice to say, why would you resist us? And of course, their point of view would be they didn't resist. Officially, Jack, at one time, Jack said, yes, we want to do it, and we put everything in motion. And then the word came back from Abramoff, no, I do not wish to be interviewed by Mr. Gibney. Well, I discovered that in the interim, the Department of Justice had leaned very hard on Abramoff and said, you do the interview and we're going to make life difficult for you. So that's an abuse of power in my view, and also I think something that did not accrue to the best public interest. I think the Department of Justice point of view was, look, we want our truth to emerge from Jack Abramoff. We don't want other people to be able to get their hands on testimony that Jack Abramoff may have given to somebody else besides our lawyers. that's a traditional lawyer's point of view. I don't think in this instance it served the public interest very well because, Jack had been sentenced and there was no abridgment on his freedom of speech, his First Amendment rights. So he should have been able to talk to us by all accounts, and I think the public interest would have been served.
Describe how far it is from Washington to the prison and exactly what you saw when you got there. How big is he in a cell? How big is it if he is? And how much time could you spend talking to him when you would drive out there?
For me, from New Jersey, it took about 6 hours, maybe a little bit more. It's a long way. It's in that funny sliver of Maryland that is way west. It almost seems like you're in Appalachia or something. And it's a very kind of antiseptic prison. It's not, it looks almost like a kind of mini mall. As you go in, you go by some officers and you enter a visiting room area, which is a bunch of chairs, unadorned, many of them facing each other. They call the prisoner comes in, and you talk. And I went and visited him a number of times, maybe 3 times, I believe, and each time talked with him for about 2 or 3 hours.
How would you describe his attitude about all this at this point?
About all what?
What's happened to him? The sentence he got, was it fair? The restitution he has to give back $25 million, all that kind of thing.
Look, I think he felt victimized, but I also, at least to me, he seemed very contrite. I think he felt he paid a heavy price. I'm not sure that the price was so heavy. Prison's not a nice place. It's, but the way his point of view on it was that he had been unfairly singled out. And I must say, to some extent, I agree with that. I think that there were many people involved in what Jack Abramoff did who didn't pay a price, and it surprises me. I don't know everything the Department of Justice knows, but I think even Jack Abramoff was surprised that certain people weren't indicted, particularly some congressmen, people, and senators. But I think Jack felt contrite. He felt very deeply burdened. I think there was a certain amount of rather unglamorous self-pity. He got himself into this mess, nobody else did. And I think he accepted that to some extent, though there were other times where he felt victimized.
If you look at the list, and I think there have been something like 18 people or 19 people that have been either pled guilty to a felony or charged. There was a former aide to Don Young, a former chief of staff of Bob Ney, congressman from Ohio, former Tom DeLay aide. There was a former aide to Senator Thad Cochran, Senator Kit Bond. You can go down. There's Interior aide, Dick Armey aide, all that. Former aide to Representative Ernest Istook. Most of all those folks are gone from the Congress. Were those the names of the people you thought should have been indicted? Any of those?
Not really. I mean, to me, I'm surprised that only the minnows showed up in court, that the really big fish got away. Now, I can't be the judge of whether or not there were indictable offenses for people like former Congressman John Doolittle, for Tom DeLay, for former Senator Conrad Burns. But some of these people, I think, were at the heart of Jack Abramoff's dealings. And it's a little surprising to me that more of the big fish didn't get netted by the federal investigation.
From your documentary, Casino Jack and the United States of Money, here's a 1-minute clip, and you're introducing us to Neil Volz.
This is truly a wildly historic night. I mean, this is just...
I was a college student, and I was a true believer in the whole Republican Revolution.
Neil Volz came to Washington with one of the newly elected congressmen of the Republican Revolution, Bob Ney from Ohio.
The mood was electric. We had the entire nation in a groundswell because this was probably one of the most exciting elections in 40-some years of Democrat control, which I and others at one point in time who were involved in politics said it won't change in our lifetime. And it did.
The Democrats had run the Congress for 40 years. There was a certain level of corruption that had taken hold. So we're rallying against that. And it's so ironic that years later I would be a face of similar type of corruption to a whole different group of people.
You know, Neil Volz said that there was a certain kind of corruption that had taken hold in town after 40 years of the Democrats in control. Was there ever a documentary done on them?
No, and I think it would be a good thing to do, frankly. Anytime there's a big intersection of money and power, you have corruption. And I think because the Democrats had been in control of Congress for so long, it was deeply corrupt. I mean, there are stories. A former senator from New Jersey was netted in a corruption scandal. There were certainly other Democrats who were.
Talking about Pete Williams?
No.
Talking about Bob Torricelli?
Yes.
Because Pete Williams went to jail.
Right. And we're talking about a documentary now, and I think it would be a healthy and useful documentary to dig into that kind of institutionalized corruption on the part of the Democrats. So, more power to somebody to do it.
Do you have a hero in your life in politics? Somebody who's in elected office?
Martin Luther King. Oh, sorry, no, that's not elected office. That was more of a groundswell. I mean, I like, in terms of a hero, I mean, there's that's a good question, and I should have a better answer. There are some people in Congress now I like, but a hero, I don't know. I guess I still go with the outsider.
Could you give us an example of somebody you like now?
Well, I was very impressed with Carl Levin's investigation when he was on the Armed Services Committee into the torture scandal. I thought that was very impressive. I think Dick Durbin and some of his recent attempts to try to stanch the flow of money in politics have been interesting. Those would be two examples of a couple of people that I think are pretty good.
Go back to the last clip where you saw the young man Neil Volz. Can you tell us about him? Why did he talk to you? Where did he talk to you? And why did Bob Ney, who is a congressman who went to prison, talk to you?
Those are good questions. I mean, Neil Volz was Bob Ney's chief of staff. And he came to Bob, as he says, very idealistically, which was interesting to me and important for me to hear, and they were rightfully trying to rudder against the kind of institutionalized corruption in Washington. But the relationship of Neil and Bob was a very interesting one in the film because you can see how the corruption sort of gnaws away at them and their relationship. A little bit like something out of Lord of the Rings, where Frodo and Sam began to go at each other's throats because of the corruption of the ring. I think so did Neil and Bob. And what's really instructive about their relationship too is in the case of Neil, he did the classic Washington journey where he comes to Congress as a staffer with a congressperson, but then over time realizes, oh my God, I really need more money, I really need to do better with my life, so he crosses to K Street where he can make the really big bucks. He starts to work for Jack Abramoff, and then even though he's not supposed to, he starts immediately lobbying his former boss, Bob Ney. And it's the corrupt use of those personal relationships that lobbyists excel at. And so it was very important to have in the midst of this story. In terms of how I got him to talk, I mean, I went to Neil right after he had been sentenced and just said, look, let's go out and have a beer and let's talk. Off the record, let's just talk. And I told him about what I was trying to do. I said I was interested in him. And would he be interested in talking to me in a sort of a broad way about his own experience, but with a larger context involved? And I think after a number of conversations, we got to a kind of trust level where he felt that would be a good idea. I think the same thing happened with Bob Ney. I mean, when I initially wrote him, I wrote him in prison, and he said he tried to shred my letters. I mean, he was very scared. Prison is a scary place, and if you do things that the prison officials don't like. You can be punished. So he didn't want to have anything to do with me. After he got out, one of my producers, Zaina Barakat, met him and talked to him about it. He then actually went and watched some of my films. And, I was able to persuade him, with Zaina's help, that, I would honor his testimony in a way that would not try to cheapen it, and to give him, sort of vent to what he wanted to say, and to put him in a broader perspective. I think also, after having spent that much time in prison, Bob was interested in trying to find a way to tell his story in a way that would have some larger impact. It was not just, here's some juicy Jack Abramoff stories, but what's really wrong with Washington. So for all those reasons, I think Bob and Neil came forward, and I'm glad they did, because I think they're at the beating heart of they're the beating heart of the film.
Where did you interview them, and where are the two of them today?
I interviewed Neil in Washington, D.C., and Bob came to New York. Bob is still in Ohio. He has a radio show now. He's a radio show host. Neil lives in Florida now, and he he works for a community group, and also works at a restaurant, I believe.
A 1:32 clip for you from your documentary on the background of Abramoff and his access to Tom DeLay.
Hit that jive jack, put it in pocket till I get back. Going downtown to see your man, and I ain't got time to shake your hand. Hit that jive jack.
Abramoff gave up movie producing to become a lobbyist. In Republican Washington, Jack was the right man at the right time.
His credentials with the conservative movement gave him access and entree with the new leadership, and instantly he saw how he could build a client base, and then that client base in turn could fund the leadership politically with campaign contributions. It became sort of a symbiotic relationship.
The relationship became ever more important as campaign costs began to soar.
The cost of campaigns went through the roof in the modern era in the last 35 years. It's just a staggering increase. The trouble is that the new technology of politics, commercials on television, polls and focus groups to design the commercials for television, are just very expensive. And no serious candidate or incumbent can say, no, I'm not going to do that, or that's beneath me, I'm not going to put myself into 30-second spots. They all do it. One of the dirty little secrets in Washington today is how much time members of the House and Senate spend every week, not just in the election season, but all the time, year-round, on the telephone, begging for money.
And I ain't got time to shake your hand.
Question about their technique there. You often have an interviewee in the shadow on one side of their face. What's that technique?
I don't know. To some extent, it's just a photographic technique. It's a kind of sculpting of the face, which makes the face a little bit more interesting. You can. It's not a technique uncommon to still portraiture. There's something about that brings out the face a little bit more when part of it is in shadow. I think also, to some extent, in this film, there is a way in which that shadow emphasizes a sense of moral ambiguity that people, there's, I don't want to get too symbolic about it, but there is a shadow, there is a light. I'm interested in that, but I didn't really do it peculiarly for those symbolic reasons. It's, I think it's beautiful actually to look at, but there is in the elements of the shadow a sense that things happen in the shadows that we don't always know about.
The music, where does that come from?
The music, one of the most fun things I about my job really is picking the music for these films. I generally have a lot of music in my films, and it often acts in two ways. One as a kind of toe-tapping Greek chorus that it stands in for my point of view sometimes, and sometimes it acts as a way of revealing character or being a kind of theme song for character. And I find it also gives, the film a little bit of energy. In terms of where I get it, I spend a lot of time listening to all sorts of music from all sorts of different genres, for everything from hip-hop to blues to country to, regular old rock and roll to classical or jazz, and try to find songs that seem to fit both the mood and the character and sometimes my own point of view.
Who's the narrator?
I am.
Jack Abramoff was born in Atlantic City in 1959. His father dabbled in the casino business and then moved to Beverly Hills when Abramoff was 10. Surrounded by children of the movie industry, Jack was a film buff at Beverly Hills High, where he was also active in student politics. A tough competitor, Jack was an all-conference lineman on the football team and a championship weightlifter. He could power squat 510 pounds.
That may be the biggest flaw in the film, but it started for me with Taxi to the Dark Side, and we were going to get a celebrity narrator for that film, but then I included a short clip of my father at the very end of the film, a video of him just before he died, and that made that film very personal to me. So I decided to do the narration on that film myself. In fact, I often do the temp narration before the actor comes in. On this one, I'd worked on it a long time. I just decided to do it myself as well. It may not be the world's greatest voice, but it has the virtue of being authentic. That is to say, it is truly my voice.
And how long is this documentary?
It's 118 minutes.
Here's some more.
He had to get to one man, Tom DeLay.
Jack Abramoff was a committed conservative. He was well known in the conservative movement, and I dealt with him no differently than I dealt with any other lobbyist.
Jack was not like any other lobbyist. He had a very special relationship with Tom DeLay. He took him on trips to Russia, Scotland, and the South Pacific. He made sure that his clients showered money on DeLay's foundation and employed his wife. And in return, DeLay let Jack market himself as the man who had access to DeLay's power.
First time I met Jack Abramoff was in the Majority Whip's office at an event. Jack is one of a kind. I mean, Jack Abramoff could sweet-talk a dog off a meat truck. He's that persuasive. He's the king of K Street. This is the guy. And he comes in for 5 minutes, sits down next to somebody who's willing to spend millions of dollars, to lobby Washington, and then he leaves in 5 minutes. And the guy or the woman thinks that Jack's talking to the president, but he's probably playing solitaire on his computer. And then he comes back in and is like, hey, sorry about that, but you got 2 more minutes. And by the way, I need about $250,000 a month. And then walks out the door. One of a kind. One of a kind.
Has Jack Abramoff seen this documentary, and if so, what's his reaction to it?
I don't know if he's seen it. And now that he's in a halfway house, I'm going to see if I can get him a copy. His lawyer, Abby Lowell, saw it, said he liked it, said there were a few issues he had with it, but he never told me exactly what they were. So I don't know yet. I know a number of people close to Jack have seen it. Some liked it, some don't.
If they don't like this, what's the reason?
Well, some people who like Jack may feel it's too tough on him. I don't think it doesn't go very easy on Jack, but I think that's fair and just.
Is it accurate to describe the prosecution of Jack Abramoff as coming from a Justice Department that was run by Republicans?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I mean, there's no doubt that the Department of Justice that came after Jack Abramoff was during the was during the period of George W. Bush. So yeah, that's a Republican administration.
We heard a lot of criticism of the Justice Department during George Bush's administration. Have we heard any positive things about the fact that inside that Justice Department, Jack Abramoff and the rest of these people we've been talking about were prosecuted? And if so, if we haven't heard it, why not?
Well, I think it's to be honest, I'd have to say that it's a mixed bag in terms of the prosecution. There was an attempt to go after this influence peddling, but I'm not sure they did the world's best job. I know that Alberto Gonzalez of Bob Ney told me a very funny story about how he was in prison when they were broadcasting the hearings of Alberto Gonzalez, bragging about how he put Bob Ney in jail. It's true, Bob Ney is a Republican congressman and he's in jail. But I'm not sure that the Department of Justice really got to the bottom of the Abramoff scandal, or I should say, got to the top of the Abramoff scandal. At the same time, the Department of Justice is a funny place. There are a lot of career people who are there. There are a lot of people who do a very good job, and yet there's a lot of political interference. And I think that was one of the things we saw in the Bush administration, particularly with the attorneys scandal, and I would say the torture scandal.
I watched your documentary in a theater, and it wasn't very crowded. And I've seen most of your documentaries from one time or another, and sometimes they're crowded, but often documentaries don't have big crowds. What's your reaction? Did you make money off of this? I know it's early in the process, and how much did your need for making money drive you in making the documentary in the first place?
Well, I always hope that my documentaries will make money, because in a way that's what keeps me going. If they don't make any money at all, then I don't make them. I think it's fair to say that Casino Jack, is not one of my more financially successful documentaries, at least so far. I think the subject for people is tough. It's a little bit mystifying to me. Most people I know who actually go see the film call me and tell me how much they like it. They could be flattering me, I don't know, but it's been hard to get people to go to this film. With a film like Enron, The Smartest Guys in the Room, that made quite a bit of money for investors, and that was a good thing for them and for me. And I think, in a way, I don't believe that the market is the only force that we should pay attention to, but the market's an important force, and I think to some extent the market has given me freedom because some of my films really have made money.
Here's a clip on the relationship between Jack Abramoff and the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands.
We were told that nobody could go through Tom DeLay without going through Jack Abramoff, and it cost us millions of dollars.
For their services, Abramoff and his firm, Preston Gates, charged the CNMI over $200,000 a month. Part of the plan was to mount tours to the CNMI for conservative writers and sympathetic congressmen like John Doolittle and Dana Rohrabacher.
We went out there to take a look at some of these clothing factories that had come in from various parts of the world in order to set up operation there. And it looked like to me that it was working.
What they would do is take a quick tour of the garment factories, and they emerge in the front doors of those factories saying, hey, there's nothing going on out here. We don't see any abuses. So what are you guys talking about?
And what would they do the rest of the time?
R&R. Generally, they would stay at the Hyatt Regency Hotel, 5 stars. There are at least 5 championship golf courses.
At some point, Jack must have realized that that's how you sell the Marianas Islands. With this abominable labor, basically indentured servitude. It's one step from slavery, but you bring people over there. It's beautiful. They got the golf courses, the nice hotels. they fell for it.
We've been out here a week now, and I think that firsthand information will help us maybe enlighten some of the others that haven't been pushing in the right direction.
By day, there were sports and games, and by night, there were cocktails, cockfights, and clubs.
This thing about the Marianas is absolutely preposterous, and we didn't find anything that was being described. And to suggest that I'm for sex slavery and human trafficking is ludicrous.
One member of Congress after another was going out there looking around saying, looks good to me. And Jack Abramoff said, I can help you.
By the way, all that video directly related to the Northern Mariana Islands, or when you saw an Asian there, the prostitutes obviously, was that from there or from somewhere else?
No, it was all from the Marianas. And there was some production footage which we took out there. But no, it's all from the Marianas.
Did you ever ask anybody why they would go that far to play golf?
Well, I did ask Congressman Rohrabacher, and he said, look, it was a miserable experience for me because, I'm a surfer and the surf wasn't that good. Well, so I don't know, but it didn't look like, from the footage that we had, that they were suffering that much. I think they went out there because it was fun. It was a long way, but it was fun. They got to play golf. They got to go snorkeling. They got to go out to the clubs at night. And they got a little take-home gift, usually in the form of some kind of campaign contributions, or a reminder that this would help them down the line in terms of influence with Tom DeLay.
Did you find out whether or not they flew out there on an Air Force plane?
I didn't find that out.
And did you find out how much Jack Abramoff made off of that whole event out there?
I'm not going to remember the figure, but it was millions of dollars. And it's kind of an ironic thing, really, for a free market ideologue like Jack Abramoff, or an anti-big government ideologue like Jack Abramoff, because that was a lot of federal dollars flow into the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas, and they were using, in many ways, some of those federal dollars to pay Jack Abramoff to lobby against federal influence. It's kind of ironic. But also there was a certain amount of money from the factory owners in the Marianas that was going to Congress people and senators.
Can you give us a ballpark figure on how much this documentary cost you?
Sure. Documentary cost about $1.6 million.
And where do you get finance for something like that?
Well, in this case, the film was co-financed by two people. Magnolia Pictures, which is a film distribution and production company that's owned by Todd Wagner and Mark Cuban, the guy who owns the Dallas Mavericks. And they distributed Enron, The Smartest Guys in the Room, and also Gonzo, so we have a relationship. Also Participant, which is a group that has funded a number of fiction and nonfiction films, notably An Inconvenient Truth by Al Gore. Not by Al Gore, it's starring Al Gore. It's by Davis Guggenheim. And Good Night and Good Luck, and some other films. So those were the two key partners that came on board. And also, to Participants' credit, one of the things they've done is to put together a website that people can investigate to really explore the issue of money in politics in a way that I think is very helpful. And that outreach aspect of this enterprise was very interesting to me.
You mentioned Guggenheim. Is that the Charlie Guggenheim family?
Yes, I believe it is.
And you also mentioned Mark Cuban, and I saw your documentary at his theater here, the Landmark Theaters in Washington, and he's got theaters, as you know, in over 15 towns and cities in the United States. If he wasn't in this business, and if he wasn't financing something like this, would you still be doing documentaries, and would there still be places in this country to go see these things?
Well, I think there would be, but I mean, I'm glad he's out there. I think he's doing a great job. I think Magnelli's doing a good job, and I also like the Landmark Theater chain. It's a good, healthy outlet for independent films. So, I mean, he's not the only one doing it, but he's an important force.
Back to your documentary. This is Ralph Reed, a name that people watching this network will remember. Let's watch. It's 1:36.
Abramoff got Ralph Reed to not only mount public opposition to this plan, but to put pressure on members of Congress, who then put pressure on the Department of Interior to prevent the Jena tribe from opening a casino.
It was very interesting to us in Indian country when a letter came out signed by a number of representatives to the Department of Interior saying, please stop what the Jena ban was trying to achieve.
Most members who signed the letter opposing the Jena casino got campaign cash from competing casinos.
Ultimately, the Jena lost. The Jena did not get their casino, and Abramoff won and defended the interests of his clients, the Kushatas.
Jack used tribal money from all his Indian clients as a piggy bank to send over $5 million to political causes and candidates, mostly Republican. Some of the biggest recipients were Bob Ney, Tom DeLay, John Doolittle, J.D. Hayworth, Patrick Kennedy, Conrad Burns.
Jack Abramoff was so skillful at convincing a lot of Indian tribes or companies to donate all kinds of money to political candidates and political parties as he saw fit. And so, yeah, Jack Abramoff was a huge rainmaker, one of the largest rainmakers in town.
You know, there are a lot of names that popped up on that. First of all, how did you do that?
How did I do what?
That whole scene with the slot machines.
Oh, well, we worked with a great design firm called Big Star in New York, and we had the concept, and then they helped us to execute it, to actually put the photographs in, to composite it and put the shadows so it has we actually shot a real slot machine, which turned out to be more difficult to do than I thought. And then we put it all together in a kind of a post-production process. It was fun.
I know I've said this a couple of times, but it's amazing how many people in your documentary are no longer in politics, no longer in power, but some are. John Breaux was on that list. He has a lobbying firm here in town. Thad Cochran's still in the Senate. Harry Reid, J.D. Hayworth's running against John McCain. Congressman Kennedy's leaving office, on and on. Did you get any sense as you saw all these names come by you and interview them that this scandal had the impact of chasing people out of Congress?
I think it did have the impact of chasing people out of Congress, and that was probably a positive development. So I don't want to minimize or overdo the idea that Jack Abramoff was scapegoated in the sense that there was no other impact. I think the Abramoff scandal, so-called, really did have an impact, and a lot of people left. On the other hand, what's interesting about Washington is, you see them coming back, and J.D. Hayworth would be a good example of that. He may unseat John McCain, who was the guy who went after Abramoff. In a kind of a bitter irony, J.D. Hayworth now touts the fact that McCain's committee didn't find anything wrong with what he was doing during this influence peddling scandal. Maybe John McCain wishes he had dug a little deeper and released a few more emails that might have revealed more about J.D. Hayworth's role. But anyway, there's no doubt. Your question is very good, and there was definitely an impact, and a lot of people lost their jobs.
There are a lot of connections and names that you've been using, and there's another one I want to ask you about, and that's the name William Sloane Coffin. I found that in your background. Explain that connection.
William Sloane Coffin Jr., the activist minister, was my stepfather. He was the chaplain at Yale. He married my mother when I was around 14. 1968, he was charged with conspiracy, I believe, with Dr. Spock, the famous baby doctor. And he had known my mother from before, and we were living in Cambridge, and he came up to be in the trial and would come by the house, and they fell in love and they got married. And then I moved to New Haven, and ultimately I went to Yale. And Bill was a big influence on my life. And I remember he also was, he died as it happened right around the same time that my father died. It was a big blow. I think in the obituary of the Washington Post, my father was on the top of the page and William Sloane Coffin Jr. was on the bottom of the page, though my father would have been annoyed that Bill booted him off the obituary page of the New York Times. But, there you go. But Bill was a very important influence on my life, and he also, when I was making Taxi to the Dark Side, urged me to hurry up. He felt very strongly about that issue.
Another quick connection, your father had 7 children, I understand, and one of them is a brother that's here at the National Journal, the Atlantic Monthly?
That's right. He's an editor at the Atlantic Monthly, James Gibney. And I have another brother, Frank Gibney Jr., who's also a journalist. So 3 out of the 7 went in. I wouldn't, I'm not a print journalist. I work in film, but nevertheless, I have, I'm told, some journalistic tendencies. So 3 of us sort of followed in our father's footsteps, and I have, I think, 3 sisters and 1 other brother, Thomas.
Another name from your documentary, we haven't seen much of him yet, but it's Michael Scanlon, who is awaiting sentencing, I understand. Let's watch.
In Washington, Jack's huge fees angered rival lobbyists. They began to leak information to the Washington Post's Sue Schmidt.
I got a call from a well-known lobbyist in Washington, a Republican, and he told me, you ought to look into Jack Abramoff. He's representing these Indian tribes and charging millions of dollars, and he's working with this young guy, Mike Scanlon, who came off Tom DeLay's staff, and Scanlon is living like a sultan.
An irresistible pitchman, Scanlon became Jack's go-to guy for selling grassroots political campaigns to the Indian tribes.
What we have built is a state-of-the-art database, political grassroots database. Let's say, for example, we had a problem with a particular state senator. Let's say that you wanted to make sure that somebody didn't win. We might not have enough to get our candidate enough votes guaranteed to win it, but we can certainly prevent somebody from getting elected.
Scanlon's political work paid off. Only a couple of years after he left DeLay's office, Scanlon was flying in private jets, dressing in hand-tailored European suits, and buying more than $20 million in real estate, including a sprawling Rehoboth Beach compound once owned by the DuPonts.
Michael Scanlon, where is he today?
Michael Scanlon, so far as I'm aware, is still living in Rehoboth Beach. One of my producers, Zaina Barakat, actually went up and chatted with him briefly, not to any consequence, but last I looked, he was still there, and he's awaiting sentencing. I believe one of the reasons that's taking so long is they're waiting for the result of the honest services fraud case that's going up before the Supreme Court very soon, as I understand it. So that would be a tough irony, I think, for Jack Abramoff. If the Supreme Court overturns honest services fraud, it's possible that Michael Scanlon might go free and might never serve any time, which, if I were Jack Abramoff, would be a bitter pill to swallow. Because I think Jack Abramoff, in my view, was a zealot who became corrupt. Michael Scanlon was closer to a kind of Washington criminal.
I'm going to run a clip next, and we had a lot of debate on whether to run this or not, but have decided to run it. And I want to tell the audience, those that are sensitive to this stuff, it's bad language. And if you don't want to hear it, please turn this off now. And we're doing it because it shows the strength of the language behind the scenes that you found in emails. It's only a minute, 10 seconds. But if you don't want to hear it, please turn it off.
Every person in America should learn one thing from Jack Abramoff. It's don't put all this in writing.
2 o'clock in the morning, I'm sleeping.
They are ripe for more pickings, and we have to figure out how. Can you meet tomorrow?
You got mail.
Kushada is an absolute cakewalk. Your cut is at least $800K.
How can I say this strong enough? You is the man.
I couldn't believe they were talking about this through email.
I can't believe they're emailing back and forth about something. They are cheap motherfuckers who don't want to pay our fees. I say fuck them, and let's go get you a different tribe which appreciates hard work.
Yes, page after page after page. My mouth just dropped to the floor. I couldn't believe it.
2.75 is chump change. What the hell were we thinking?
According to your emails, you and Mr. Scanlon referred to tribes as morons, stupid idiots, monkeys, effing troglodytes, which you defined as a lower form of existence, and losers.
I hate those fucking ingrates. I told Cherokee to come up with the dough or prepare for another trail of tears.
Why did you use that?
Because I thought, very much like the audio tapes of the Enron traders who took down the California grid, that it betrayed, the language itself betrayed a kind of moral bankruptcy, really. And you can hear the viciousness. It's the viciousness of the language that I think is telling. And that's why it was important to use it and not just bleep it. Sometimes it's hard to hear the face of immorality, but that would be it.
People want to buy this and watch the whole thing. What's it cost, and can they do it now?
I don't think they can do it yet. It will be out on video. It's still, depending on where you live, making the rounds in theaters around the country. And the best place to find out about that is to go to the website, Magnolia Pictures website. I think it's magpictures.com.
You've had a lot of write-ups, a lot of reviews, and one is rather critical. I'm sure you've read it by Gary Chaffetz. You know him?
Sure, I know Gary. I've played tennis with him.
And this was on June the 9th, or June the 5th is when we pulled it down. He's a former Boston Globe reporter on the Huffington Post, which you also write for.
I've written for the Huffington Post.
He says, there are so many disappointing things with this documentary, I don't know where to begin. My overarching problem was that Gibney made no attempt to be objective and that he omitted a plethora of important information that might have afforded the audience the opportunity to draw a more balanced, nuanced, and certainly more informed conclusion about this complex scandal. He, prior to that, says that he says you're both hardcore liberals, put all that into context for us?
I'm not sure how to put it into context. I mean, Gary and I had long arguments about this. Gary wrote a book about this called The Perfect Villain, in which he tried to make the argument that Jack Abramoff was wrongly accused, shouldn't have been prosecuted, shouldn't have gone to jail, and fundamentally didn't do anything terribly wrong. And I just disagree. In terms of was it objective or balanced, I think you have to say that a lot of sides were represented in this. Tom DeLay is interviewed for the film. Bob Ney is interviewed for the film. Neil Volz is interviewed for the film. I went out to the Marianas. Sue Schmidt, who broke who helped to really break the whole Monica Lewinsky scandal story, is interviewed for the film. This is not like a packet of liberals, ganging up on Republicans. Just the opposite. It's actually more or less from the inside out of the Republican Party. And I think what Gary didn't do. I mean, Gary didn't go out to the Marianas. Gary didn't go down to speak with the Tigua tribe in El Paso, Texas. He didn't go down to Louisiana to talk with the Coushatta. And he didn't talk to Bob Ney. He didn't talk to Adam Cadan. He didn't talk to a lot of people. So my view is that I did a pretty thorough job, really, of reporting and filming this story, and I just disagree with what Gary says.
By the way, he calls in here the work that Susan Schmidt did sleazy. Why would he do that? What's his point on that one?
That's a good question. I mean, Gary, in his book, is very angry about Sue Schmidt's reporting. He believes that she grossly misrepresented the Tigua affair, which is the attempt by Jack to lobby for the Tigua Indians of El Paso. I think Gary's argument is overwrought. Susan Schmidt and her colleagues at the Washington Post won a Pulitzer Prize for their reporting. I don't think her reporting was sleazy.
Last clip before we say goodbye. You used Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Let's watch.
It has become so accepted, so part of our political culture now, that it's normal. Your average citizen doesn't have the voice that he or she would expect to have, because these voices are much louder and they're much better financed.
This is a story about human failure. I mean, I don't think that corruption is a partisan issue. The corruption I was involved in was a human failure. It's an issue of power. I became just a machine, a cog in the machine, like, hey, get up, go do your thing, get yours. I just lost track of what brought me here.
Abramoff couldn't have flourished if this system itself was not corrupt, where the need for money, the members of Congress and their need for money, is so voracious and so huge that they don't have their guard up.
This has all gone into a feeding frenzy with money.
Well, what do you expect me to do?
I don't know what the solution is. I would have loved to have public financing. Here's your money, and here's your money, and you don't have to raise any. This would end all of that if you had a different system, but right now, we don't.
There's no place out there for graft, or greed, or lies, or compromise with human liberties. Great principles don't get lost once they come to light. They're right here.
I think the lesson that we all should take from this is that the price for a free society, I think, is to be vigilant about our democracy. They were only able to be influenced by Jack Abramoff and take advantage of the money he was offering because we let them.
Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Anything changed since that came out with Jimmy Stewart?
What did the French have an expression? Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more things change, the more things stay the same. I think things have gotten a lot worse in terms of the influence of money in politics, a lot worse. But corruption was always there, and that's why I think Melanie Sloan's comment there about how we have to be eternally vigilant is the right one. But Jefferson Smith is a really interesting figure and character because he embodies the kind of American naivete, but a kind of bold and important naivete, meaning the urge to create out of moral wreckage something good. Ironically, I think he's also a kind of argument against term limits. One of the reasons that Jefferson Smith, in that great Capra film, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, gets manipulated is because he comes in as the rube and doesn't know that much. And who knows more and who knows how the machinery works? It's the lobbyists, the ones who always stay there. So if you have a kind of rotating crop of congresspeople and senators, it's not really the best way to solve this problem. But I think that Mr. Smith Goes to Washington is still a very important film for us because we have to remember our ideals, our idealism, and fight for it. That's what it's all about, it seems to me.
So when can we see in the theaters, outside of the Tribeca Film Festival earlier, your documentary on talk show host Elliot Spitzer?
Has that been officially announced? Is he officially a talk show host now?
Well, he has been one in the last couple of weeks, so I thought maybe
that's true.
Maybe leading that way.
It's going to Magnolia Pictures. The same people who distributed this film will have the film out, I believe, later this year. So keep your eyes peeled. I think it's a pretty good one.
Alex Gibney, our guest. Documentary is called Casino Jack and the United States of Money. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Brian. Good to be here.
I'd seen friends, like Tony Rudy, Mike Scanlon, go over to go work for Jack Abramoff and kind of watch this operation get built, right? And Jack was going from really big to the top.
Neil morphed from the original Neil who wanted to be the press secretary to the guy that wanted to be part of the Abramoff family. Now, was it unusual to lose a staffer? I've had staffers come and go like, a revolving door.
I'm the poster child for the revolving door.
The revolving door between government and K Street is an essential part of the Washington game.
There's a law that states you're not allowed to lobby your former bosses. And I tiptoed around the one-year ban, and then I just flat out violated it.
Tonight on C-SPAN, Prime Minister's Questions with British Prime